This isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. The Middle Ground Mike is fighting for truth and unity. Subscribe now or support us today. Links are in the notes. Stand with us. All right, good evening, everybody. It's Joe from the Middle Ground Mike. America keeps talking about China, but most people really have no clue what's happening behind the scenes. We did an episode not that long ago on China. We've got Marc Ross here. It's a guy who's wrote a book on China and emerging both realities. The book is called, I believe, Attacking the Dragon. It's a book some people are calling the most realistic fiction about the next global crisis. But here's the kicker. The craziness in this book, a lot of it is based on real conversations, real tensions, and real events he himself has seen up close. And if you want to understand where these relations are and where they're really heading, and not the spin that you see on TV that tells you that the whole world's, crawl into your bed, tune in, listen to this episode. I'm Joe. This is the Middle Ground Mike. Let's roll. Marc, I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Joe, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I was really bummed about the last time. We didn't get to have the show, but, introduce yourself, tell everybody a little bit more about your book.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, my name's Marc Ross, or at least that's my pen name. And the book is called Attacking the Dragon. Here it is. My people tell me I'm supposed to hold it. And what the book is basically about is that China is involved in global expansion. Everybody knows that. One of China's key means for that is something called its Belt and Road Initiative, by which it develops infrastructure projects around the world in many countries. And what this book is about, it's a thriller, it's a novel, is there's a secret group that is looking to push China back into its borders by undercutting the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's doing so through terrorism. It's destroying Belt and Road Initiative projects, it's undercutting the financing of it, it's attacking the party. It's full of false identities, double crosses, duplicity, action, all the good things you like to see in a thriller type book. But what really makes this book particularly different in Western fiction is that all of our books involving China in the thriller area, China is always the villain. They're the ones initiating the hacking attack. They're going to shut down, this place, that place, their military, etc. Here, having nothing to do with anything other than coming up with an interesting and different story, China is the target. China responds, but it didn't start this. It is being attacked, and two Americans, a businessman and an American ambassador, get drawn into this, looking to find out who is actually behind this, while they themselves become targets, or at least one of them does, and the Chinese don't trust them. Terrorist organizations are after them, and the question is, can they find out who's behind all this? Can the Chinese find out? Are the Americans behind it? Who knows? We have to read the book to find out. And that's basically what it's about.
Yeah, the Belt Road, wasn't that at one point called the Silk Road Initiative at one point?
Well, the Silk Road, if you remember your history, was the original trade route going from China all the way across Asia and reaching all the way to Europe. That's where all the spices came from and everything like that. The Belt and Road Initiative, which was originally called Open Belt, Open Road, came about in the early 2010s by Xi. And its name was changed, so it's now officially the Belt and Road Initiative. And right now, China has done infrastructure projects under it in about 150 countries. So we're not talking about, some small little thing. This is really big. And the way it works, these countries owe China for this work over $1 trillion today. So we're talking about a large sum of money for many countries that can't pay it back. And so, here we're seeing efforts being made by the terrorists to push China out of different countries and undercut its role in the world. And they're potentially many people who might be behind that. And so we focus on that. We have a destruction of a dam as one part of the terrorist attack. And interestingly, in South America last year, a dam that was built as part of this project, the Belt and Road Initiative, had to be shut down because it had too much damage to it. I doubt that was sabotage, but it's an interesting sort of comparison to what was going on. And so that's a large part of the book. And what we're trying to do is, I've spent a lot of time in China. And so over the years, I've been to many different parts of China, what they call first tier cities like Beijing and Shanghai, second tier and third tier. And I've spent time one-on-one with Communist Party officials, government officials, a lot of business executives and professionals, Chinese lawyers, accountants, etc. One time I've spent time with the guy who was negotiating with Google about their access into the country. So I've met a lot of very interesting people, did a lot of lecturing. So I've used a lot of that in the book. So for people who know China, and I've gotten this reaction from some of those people, they go, oh yeah, that's exactly what this hotel, this area is like, what these people are like. But for people who really don't know China, it's, I think, an interesting exposure to it. You know, it gives you a sense of what it's like and draws a distinction between the people and the government. And there's a huge distinction in China. We should never confuse the Chinese people with the party or the Chinese government. And that's one of the things I try and make clear in the book. Well, we talk about China as if it's a completely unitary one piece, that there's no distinction between the people, the party, the government, and that's really not accurate. They do not have the diversity that we do. You know, they talk about us as a fractured country. They view us and they are confused by us. They have a hard time understanding us because they look and see what our government does and how our government shifts its policies over time in a way that they don't. You know, if we have a Democratic administration, we may have one approach towards them. In a Republican, we may have a different. Theirs is very different in terms of, you know, they're under Xi. It's a very straight line in terms of how things operate. So there's a real difference there.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's probably pretty accurate. I think people here may think of it because we think of communism as, if you would just want to say like, one voice as a collective, like I think so that's maybe why people interpret it that way.
Yeah, I don't, they call themselves the Communist Party. I'm not an expert on communism, but I don't think that China's setup is what Marx and Engels envisioned when they were thinking of communism. This is a state-run, state-controlled economy, political system, military, culturally, and it's all from the top down. The concept of taking care of each person and, to each person, depending upon their needs, that's not what China is about. China is about building China and developing and expanding it, and that's where all its efforts go.
Yeah. Well, you open with your book or you open with a terrorist attack on China. That's that's bold. Because I can imagine that's probably pretty hard to do. Or if it's happened there, they keep it under tight wraps.
Yeah,
is that a real scenario that's happened there?
No,
Oh,
no. This is fiction. And, the way we oppose the Belt and Road Initiative and China's global expansion is very different. For instance, just a week or two ago, a U.S. official in Greece suggested that China sell its ownership of the port, Piraeus, which is the primary port in Greece, sell it either to Greece or maybe to us. And China said, no, forget that idea. But that was the approach taken in terms of trying to cut back China. Think of the Panama Canal. Right now it's owned by a group out of Hong Kong. And an effort is being made, I don't know whether it'll ever happen, to transfer ownership, to have it bought by a consortium led by America. So we're talking about very different sorts of approaches. We're not going into, as far as I know, different countries and blowing up Belt and Road structures or undermining governments that are collaborating with China in these. Now, would I be shocked if we did some of that? No, but I have no knowledge of it. But as far as my beginning, yes, it starts with a terrorist attack. Interestingly, I started the book with a very different approach on the first draft, where it was a very slow build-up, sort of setting the stage before the terrorist attacks started. And then I decided, let's kick this off with a bang. So that's exactly what I did, kick it off with a bang.
No, that's pretty, it's intense. Like a terrorist attack in China, it's hard to grasp, so that's definitely like a great thing to really pull people in with. The main character, from my understanding, gets targeted by both terrorists and Chinese officials.
Let's take a quick break.
The Middle Ground, Mike, isn't just another podcast. It's a movement for unity, for truth, for a future beyond the left and the right. But movements don't grow without people willing to stand up. Subscribe now on Buzzsprout. Fuel this mission directly on PayPal. Every subscription keeps the fire burning. The links are in the show notes. Be more than a listener. Be part of the Middle Ground.
Is the position taken in the book, and I think it's an accurate one, is that when anything negative happens regarding China, the U.S. is the number one suspect. They look to us. We're their most serious enemy, opponent, whatever term you want to use. So they look to us and say, well, is the U.S. behind this? And that's very clear these days, especially if you look at the relationship. But here, it happens because he happens to be there at that moment, and he's with a very high-ranking Chinese official, and it becomes very suspicious. And she's hurt in it, and many people are killed in it, but he survives. So there's a great deal of suspicion, and he's a businessman. He's not a government official, but he gets pushed into by the government to try to help solve who's behind this. So the Chinese are very suspicious of it, and they are after him. His name is Wes, and they don't trust him or the American ambassador to this African country where another sabotage has taken place. A dam is destroyed. So most of the destruction takes place outside China, but we do have several incidents within the country.
Well, you've said, I've read the pieces of this book come directly from real events. What's one scene without spoilers per se that people won't believe is real, but basically is?
Okay. My hero, the American businessman, relates how when he first started going to China, his Chinese women came up to him and asked him if he was Owen Wilson, the actor, because of he's written to have a more than passing similarity in terms of his look. Now, that is actually based on my own experience involving Richard Gere. When I first started going to China, a number of Chinese women asked me if I was Richard Gere, and they were focusing on Pretty Woman and the character he played in that. Gray hair, glasses, etc. Now, I don't look like Richard Gere. You know that, and I know that. I'm also much taller than Richard Gere, but he's a lot more successful. But when I first started going there, Caucasians were not as familiar. Now, nobody would ever think such a thing or, give it a passing thought. But literally that happened to me several times. And so I used that in the book. And I actually used it. I was once on the Conan O'Brien show when he had his network show. And we did a whole comic piece about that, where I was the Richard Gere of China in a whole piece for commercial for soap suds involving Julia Roberts' picture in the bathtub with the bubble bath. So there is truth behind that one. It's a little weird. But in addition, the places that I involved are places that I all know and have spent time. Different hotels, for instance, there's a very important hotel in Beijing called China World. It's no longer a preeminent hotel, but it goes back a long ways and it's got a very Chinese feel about it. But for instance, when I've stayed there, they always have up on the balcony a woman playing an instrument that's like a harp. It's not technically a harp, but it's very similar to it. And the first time I was there, I'm listening to it, interesting Chinese music. And then I realized she's playing a version of Simon and Garfunkel's Sounds of Silence on this Chinese harp. Yeah, it was very
Oh,
interesting.
that's well,
It was very nice. It was a lovely version.
yeah, I guess I just never thought of Simon and Garfunkel on a harp before. I'm
Either
just
had
trying to
a,
like I'm just trying to like hear it in my head, like how would that like sound like?
yeah, yeah. No, it was,
Wow.
yeah, so it was interesting. So I use a lot of that. There are different places. There's something called the giant Lishan Buddha, which is a statue of a Buddha, which was carved into a cliff face like 1,000 years ago, maybe even, no, 900 years ago, to be fair. And it is huge. It's about 270 feet high and it's massive. And I've been there. So I set a scene there, a critical scene, with a race. It's got a staircase where you can walk up and down along that 270 feet on both sides, and it's cut into the rocks. If you slip, you actually could fall and take a very dangerous fall. But I thought it'd be a great place to have a chase scene going up the Buddha and seeing how tired you get trying to race up the Buddha. So used a lot of scenes like that.
Yeah, I mean that's so kind of playing on that a little bit. What's like the most like playing it off of the fiction aspect, merging it obviously with like the real aspect, like your book does. What's the most misunderstood truth about China that maybe America or the world gets wrong? Like when you look at the book, and like you kind of just like how you're interpreting it.
Well, I think it goes back to what I said about viewing China as a unity, as one thing, and looking at the people, the government. I have always found the Chinese people to be incredibly nice, helpful, considerate. I have absolutely nothing negative to say about them as individuals. Doing business with them is a different story because they have a different thoughts about how one does business. But as people, if you meet people, have dinner with people, have a drink with them, just walking on the street and meeting people, they've always been nothing but a pleasure. And I've never felt as an American that there's any sort of built-in bias against me as a result of that. And I think that's one thing that people misunderstand, so that when they think of Chinese people in China, and sometimes even overlapping to Chinese Americans here, there's like a built-in bias, which I don't think is appropriate at all.
No, it should never be. Is China kind of playing on that, but is China more afraid of America than we think or less? Just like, based on like, like the terrorist part you had in your book, but then also like the public perception.
Yeah, I would say that China is worried about us going crazy. I don't think that when they consider what rational actions we might take, that they have any concern. I don't believe that China believes that we're going to attack them, for instance, not at all. Now, if they would attack Taiwan, then that becomes a very interesting issue, and we've equivocated as a country about, what we would really do. But I think they only fear the irrational on our part.
Yes, I mean that definitely the current president definitely gives them that impression for sure. No stability there in that aspect.
No, and plus we're not always consistent nor are they. I mean, if you think about it, take the tariffs as an example. Tariffs have gone up vis-a-vis China, they've gone down. We've said this, we've said that. They have as well. It's, I think, hard for both sides to have a good understanding and a satisfactory relationship when things change so quickly.
Yeah,
I
no,
think stability is important.
Especially, like, when it comes to them, it seems like, you've worked with people who operate in China, right? And in your book, it seems obviously with some of those things, it's like a gray zone. Maybe that's like the best way to put it, like the business, the politics from your character and mixing it with like Percy real life. What's the biggest risk that the character slash maybe even real life don't see coming?
Well, I think one major issue certainly is if you're in a role in China where your business, what you do, ties to the government in some way. So, for
Yes.
instance, in Attacking the Dragon, one of the important characters is the engineer in charge of building a dam in an African country as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. He works for a private company, but because it's part of the Belt and Road Initiative, it's fundamentally tied to the government, and the government has an interest in it. And something bad happens. And rather than it just being a businessman or an engineer where there's a problem, it becomes a political issue. The government gets involved, and the government can basically do whatever it wants. And so for people who are in that sphere of the Chinese world, that's a factor that they always have to deal with. While I think a much smaller number of people here in the United States have to worry about, well, the way I'm operating my business, is the government going to interfere as a purely political matter? Now, we've seen some of that happen, frankly, in the last few years, but much less than what the fear factor is in China.
Right. No, I mean, China is a fear factor to a lot of people here. They, if your book, let's say, somehow became real life tomorrow, which, sometimes fiction becomes reality, like we were talking earlier, what's the first thing the US government should prepare for?
Well, this book is actually, or what is happening in the book, can be viewed as good for the United States. And in fact, to the extent that there's a terrorist attack against China, China suspects the United States as a possible, player behind this. And some of the Americans do, because who can say, from one department of the government to another, is the CIA or somebody else doing this sort of thing? So there's a real unknown factor there, which highlights, if you will, the issue of who is going to really be behind this. And if somebody else did do this sort of thing to China, would we be upset? I mean, we're opposed to terrorism, but would we be that upset if China's Belt and Road Initiative, suffered problems? I don't think so.
Publicly, we might, but I don't think privately we would. Publicly, we may
Yeah.
go, oh, then that is
No,
not acceptable.
actually, one thing that one of the actions that are taken in the book, one of my friends who's a real China expert, after he read it, said to me, it's interesting. I don't know why any countries who have gotten involved in the Belt and Road Initiative haven't done this to get out from China's thumb. So now I'm curious to see whether it'll happen at some point.
I mean, it may.
It
You
may.
know, sorry, go ahead.
The way these structures are built, I think it's important to understand. Country agrees, for instance, that China will build a dam, an airport, whatever, a stadium. The construction is almost always done by a Chinese company using local labor, but a Chinese company is in charge of it. The money for this is not put up by the country generally, especially not if it's a less developed country or underdeveloped country. They borrow the money from Chinese banks, either private Chinese banks or government-controlled banks. Then that country uses that money to pay the Chinese developer for its work. So most of the money then has cycled back into China, and the country is left with a debt to China. At this point, that debt is over $1 trillion. And a lot of that is being renegotiated on what many people consider to be absolutely robbery terms. very, very aggressive terms. Here in the US, we call them sort of terms used in vulture funds. You swoop down and buy a troubled company or lend to a troubled company on incredibly expensive terms. And that's in part what's going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm a normal American, right, who doesn't, not that normal Americans don't, but if I'm an American, I should say, who doesn't follow, geopolitics, right? What's how does that book like interpret for them the real relationship between the US and China?
Well, I think what it really shows you is the uncertainty of the relation, how China immediately looks at the US as the possible source of its problem. The US has an ambivalence in the sense that if it's a Chinese problem, that ain't necessarily so bad. So the book focuses heavily on that. It also gets into some other areas. It gets describing some life of some of the people and some philosophical issues dealing with morality and how far will you go to carry out what you need to do. One character is faced with how far will he go to save his wife and daughter? Will he do something that could kill hundreds of people? We all say if it's between my family and, somebody else is in trouble. But is there a limit to how far you go? So it gets into issues like that. And, I think the resolution of it is interesting.
No, I mean it's I mean China America is just it's a very complicated, right? China's obviously the Belt Road Initiative, right? They're expanding their influence is expanding like crazy, not necessarily territorially. I know when people think expanding, they think of outside of like the last 60 years, they think of like all previous human history where expansion means conquering. I think that type of, I mean, with the exceptions, I'm sure it'll still happen or whatever at some point with something, but for the most part, that I don't think that'll be the norm anymore. When there's a war.
I would agree with you. I mean, China certainly vis-a-vis Mongolia could at some point be a threat. Certainly has been vis-a-vis Tibet, Taiwan, certainly Korea, South Korea, and Japan certainly worry about that. Their militaries are very focused, especially Japan's, on that issue. But no, I think that the larger issue is just China's dominance, economic dominance, financial dominance, and cultural dominance.
Yeah, I know financially they are a little bit more disciplined than we are.
Yeah.
You were mentioning about the cities.
Joe, can I interrupt you there? Only not as much as you might think. I mean, if you go to China, you will see what are called ghost cities,
I was
which
just
are
about to ask you that question.
okay. These, which by the way, I make sure that I stick into attacking the dragon. But ghost cities are basically cities or parts of cities that were built as real estate developments, which have never been finished or have never been occupied. So literally, you can drive by them and you just see these large high-rise buildings, whether they're apartment houses, office buildings, and it's clear that they're empty, that no one's there. It's like this big structures with black holes where the windows are, and there's nothing behind them. And that's a real example of China not necessarily doing things right. China's real estate problems are tremendous. China domestically doesn't necessarily operate as well as it does internationally. And over the last number of years, the focus has been more on the international activities than the domestic, although the current focus is supposedly shifting back, but we'll see whether that really plays out.
Yeah, I remember when I learned about the ghost cities, and it's been a while. I read about them. I think like almost 10 years ago or so. But I read it was, I mean, like, and when I say like financially disciplined, maybe I mean in terms of efficiencies and a lot of certain things where they seem to have a little bit more of a thumb on their money than we do as a government. It may not be the best decisions, but they at least have an idea of where it's all going. Where sometimes it seems like ours
I think
don't.
they may know where it's going, but remember, the difference is this is their decision. So the US government doesn't get to say, for instance, all right, you company, you're going to do this, or we're going to pour at a magnitude that we do not match here. Like when we were trying to develop, solar and wind, a lot of money was funneled in that direction. The government supported that, tax credits, etc. China picks sectors and focuses resources on them in a way beyond what we do. They are very, very good at doing that. And
Yeah,
because of their authoritarian type nature, they can do that.
yeah, I've come out in I don't say like opposition to the electric slash solar situation, but America has massive natural gas reserves. Like, I think between us and Canada and Mexico, we have more than anybody else in the world. In hydrogen cars, a lot of what they get to power them is they extract the hydrogen from the natural gas. And it's not identical to petroleum in terms of the system, but the delivery, if they had to transport, build pipelines, you've already got the infrastructure there that you could not necessarily use the same one, but you could build it, with it parallel. And I think that, especially here in the cold states, right? Electric cars, the batteries in the cold months, like they cut in almost half. And I think, and it's just, I know it's kind of like off subject, but, I view hydrogen as a way that we can use our resources, something that they don't have, that we have an advantage on. And I mean, I felt like our government put too much money into solar. Not that they shouldn't have put anything. I felt like we rely too heavily on something where we depended on the resources from a nation that we're competing with. To
Well, that
like
that
how do
that
you
may
compete?
be that may be actually. I'd like, in terms of putting your money someplace. One of the things that I always focus on is diversification, and I think that over the last number of years, going back a good ways, we have not adequately diversified our foreign sources of manufacturing. So we're so dependent upon China as a source of manufacturing. Now we're trying to move into other countries as well. We have, but we're still very, very dependent. And we don't use as many countries now. Obviously China was the cheapest source of labor or capable labor for a good period of time. But diversifying from that is a valuable thing for us to do. And we are working on that.
Yeah, they who is it? I called the Kevin O'Leary approach to China.
Mm,
So I remember when Trump first announced I think what was his first thing, 150% tariffs, or I believe that was the rate.
yes. I think
Well,
that's about right.
Kevin O'Leary came out and said, "That's too little." He goes, "They're going to laugh at you." He said, "If you want to get Xi Jinping to the table," he said, "you walk out and you say 400% starting today, unless you're here in Washington next week." And he said, just like the president of the United States, if nobody in China has a job, he's not going to retain power over there. And he said you would bring China to the table a whole lot faster. And I don't know. I mean, I'm just asking, like,
I
this
don't
is
I don't know the
paraphrasing and
answer to
fiction.
that one either. That's well beyond where my
I just
expertise
I thought 400% would have
lies.
been. Would the
Nothing the
Chinese
hefty thing.
retaliate? Do you think on something like that, or do you think they would actually
Look,
come to the
they
table?
they've got tremendous ability to hurt us economically as well. I mean, imagine if they completely cut off the rare earth supplies. Imagine if they shut down factories of US companies sitting in China. You'd have a lot of Chinese people laid off, but think of the impact on American companies. If you couldn't get your sneakers, you couldn't get your phones, you couldn't get a lot of things. So, you know, we need a symbiotic, we're stuck in a symbiotic relationship, and we need to recognize that and maximize the value of that rather than thinking we're not dependent upon each other in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. I mean, that's U.S. companies always seem to plan, behind closed doors about China, right? There's just not always a lot of public. I know what I've always understood is, they're afraid of like IP theft, right? That always seems to be like the big topic when you talk China. Is that like like that IP theft, right? Like I would imagine like some aspect of that like plays into fears that plays into the book.
Well, I think the IP issue is a very serious issue, and China absolutely has been guilty of various IP theft over many years. I don't think anybody questions that. That's less of a target here in this book because of the nature of the sabotage and the terrorism that's going on. But there are thoughts about a sequel, and one of the thoughts for the sequel is actually damaging Chinese IP infrastructure, part through theft of it, and in part through damaging critical technologies and critical locations. And we'll see whether book follows reality or vice versa. And actually, I had that with my first book, which dealt with domestic extremism and basically involved a government plot infiltrate the extreme left to find members, the leaders of Antifa. And those who've read that book, I got a lot of emails when the Trump administration announced that Antifa was being labeled as a major terrorist organization and a heavy focus was going to be placed upon rooting out Antifa. It was very much, like reality following fiction.
Yeah, because
Not that
if
I'm suggesting they read my book. No,
I mean, Antifa, there's no centralized organization as far as I'm
There is
aware that
there
I've.
is not. There is not. And if you look up Antifa online and you really dig in deep, it is very hard to prove in more than one or two places anyone who holds themselves out as being part of Antifa. And those few that there are, and I did a fair amount of research on this, those few that there are really not national in scope, very small, narrow things. And I have personally have not heard of any attacks by somebody claiming to be members of Antifa here in the United States in ages. Maybe there were in the past, but I'm not aware of any. Sort of like the anarchists in the early 19th century in England and here. The anarchists at that time were their versions of the Antifa or the extreme right. They were the villains that everybody feared in terms of damaging society. Here then became the communists. Now it's less the communists and fellow travelers than it is the extreme left, Antifa, people like that. So it
Yeah,
changes over time.
what's like what's the biggest thing from your book, right? As we kind of like go towards that people need to take, because it's fiction meets reality, right? And it's blended. Maybe this would be a better way to put it. Same for they kind of say like the engaged with China crowd, right? um, you know, how does that kind of all play into it? Like, what do they get right? What do they get wrong? When you're kind of looking at it from your book's perspective.
Well, from my book's perspective, from Attacking the Dragon, what we're seeing is that there is, first of all, as I mentioned before, a huge difference between the people in China and the government and the party. And we cannot lose sight of that, which is not to say that every person in China is a good person, more than every person here in the United States is a good person. But we really have to separate the two. And the book works hard to try and draw that distinction. I mean, we have one character whose entire life is destroyed because he makes an incredibly innocuous comment, sort of reflecting third hand on a decision regarding the party. And as a result, his boxing career is destroyed, and he ends up having to work in a steel mill in the frozen wasteland of northern China. And while that may be an extreme example, the influence of the party is that pervasive and it's that serious.
I mean, yeah, it's. I know they think a whole different way than we do over there. What gives you hope that this doesn't all end badly? And you would have a pretty good perspective considering you've had a lot of experience with the average Chinese. Like, and then like your book and just it's perspectives that matter a lot, right? Because there's facts and then perspectives feed into the facts.
Perspective becomes reality is a line I use in the book in Attacking the Dragon. And I think China, the Chinese government and the Chinese party are very big users of that and have been for many years. We probably are too. I mean,
No doubt.
every time a politician gives a speech and it's full of what we no longer call lies, but are called inaccurate statements or falsehoods. Uh, that's an attempt to shape perception so that people perceive it as reality. There's no doubt about that.
Oh yeah, no doubt. China in 2035, as wrap up here, right? China 2035, is it going to be rising or declining still? Or rising still or declining?
I think China in 2035 will probably be the preeminent country. I hope that's not the case, but I also don't think that the world will end as a result, or that the United States will, end as a result of that. We may not always have the largest economy. We're going to be past. There's no doubt about that. We don't have the largest military. Whether we will have the most capable technology-wise remains to be seen, but we're not going to be able to claim dominance across the board. And I think that's a reality that we have to recognize. And while all that's going on, let us not forget Russia.
Yeah, they are
We
the
don't, we
wild
don't pay
card.
much, we only pay attention to Russia these days in talking about Ukraine. But as compared to China, Russia's the one that has the nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and they're a lot more. They seem to be a little bit more open to using them than the Chinese are.
Well, certainly Putin has made comments.
Yeah, he's a wild card.
He's
I
not
mean,
shy.
no, not at all. I mean, he does not mince words.
No.
Mark, I really appreciate you coming on here, and especially like I'm telling you, folks, especially China has seemed to have been a really hot topic on this show. Right, people really tune into it. I mean,
Good.
like turn into his book, check it out because perspectives are everything. And then, to me, even though, it's fiction blended with reality, it does help give it a little bit more of an understanding of the process, because process is so important.
I think so, Joe. And I think my hope is that when people read the book, they will enjoy it. We read thrillers because we enjoy them. We enjoy the rush of them, etc. And I hope people enjoy it for that purpose. There's some humor in it. I hope somebody told me recently they got to one part and laughed out loud. I hope your readers, your listeners, if they buy it, one or two scenes that they laugh out loud and enjoy it.
Oh, most definitely. Everybody, the link to his website and book will be in the comments. Please definitely check it out because if not, you will be missing out on something good. And definitely like it'll get your juices flowing. And that's like key, especially when you read something, right? And if you like politics, if you like news, this is something that'll really get you going. It gets the mind going without getting into that lull that can come from too much politics being pushed in your face every day.
Thank
No,
you, Joe.
and that to me, that's important, right? Because you need to understand things, but you also don't want to get burned out on it either. And it's kind of like everything in life, right? You got to have a balance
Yeah.
and too much one way or the other. So you need to blend it. Everything's
You can
blended.
enjoy it and you can learn something from it and, spark some discussion, all to the good.
Yeah. And I
But
mean,
you,
it's,
but you got to read it to get that.
yes. And especially with China folks, if you're an adult listening to this, definitely maybe you should get this for your kids because it's their future that they've got to interpret. Our future's already been written for the most part at our ages. So it's up to us to put the younger generation in the driver's
There you
seat, give
go.
them the keys. And books like this can help them, right? Because it funnels the imagination. It opens their eyes. And that's like so key is opening their eyes and getting their heads out of the sand. Because that seems to just be the mentality these days is just put your head in the sand and hopefully when you pull it out, everything's fine.
Yeah.
And books like yours really help people get that clear picture because clarity is something that people really desire now. And, some books obviously are so fiction, like, I mean, it's obvious, right? But having something that kind of blends both.
This is not fantasy. This is
Right.
taking reality and tweaking it.
Yeah. And it's so important because kids respond to that. Younger people do. They respond to things like that. And everybody does really, but just this younger generation. Like I read a study from Yale and I brought this up in several episodes that Gen Z, 18 years old to 21 years old, are 12 points more conservative than Gen Z that's 22 to I think 27.
Hmm.
when the ones they
Interesting.
polled. And when you dig into the survey study a little bit more, is they grew up during COVID. They came of age during COVID.
Very
And
interesting.
so that's the world they grew up in. The only thing that they seen was control, telling me what to do. And then obviously, they seen the opposite side's the opposite of that. But what really is telling is kids feel lost these days. This is the reason why I bring that up is for the first time, I think they said since like 30s or 40s, that now more men are going to church on like a per person basis, however they were calculating it, than women, and in the younger crowd. And then the younger crowd is going to church at a pace not seen since the greatest generation. They're going at a faster pace than millennials and Gen X and
You're
boomers.
also seeing a significant move to the Orthodox
Yes.
Church. It has expanded dramatically to the point where I've read that the Orthodox Church leaders can't handle or have a challenge of how to handle the large number of people who are interested in their orthodoxy.
Yeah, and people feel lost because they don't understand, because people get tuned out when all they do is they open up the book and it goes, when you wake up tomorrow, the world's going to be over because you didn't do this, this, and this. You thought this way. Whereas a book like yours kind of gets their imagination flowing without convincing them that the world's going to end tomorrow. And
The
that
world
is,
is not going to end tomorrow, but you got to know what's going on and you got to be intelligent about it. And hopefully, this will give some people who read this a little insight.
yeah,
If
and,
they
and
read the
that's
other
what,
book, they'll get some insight about domestic extremism.
yeah, and I mean, not I love, but it was just so ironic about the fact that I had done that episode with a guy who identifies with Antifa, and then you had done the book on it and didn't even put two and two together. And and that was just a very eye-opening experience for me, because my understanding of domestic terrorism, things of the was vastly different than what some of these folks believe and how they see the country. And the ironic part is no matter which side you're on, left or right, when you look at it, they both are completely wrong with how these people see the world.
Undoubtedly.
Neither one of them are right. They go, well, they see it this way. Then the opposite. No, 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 they're seeing it this way because no, actually, they really can't stand either one of you. They see you both as the enemy. There is no virtue in any of this. They literally see anybody who does not see things the way they do. Not all of them, because I don't know all of them, but just from what I do know, is they
The
see the
concept
establishment.
today that if somebody doesn't agree with you, they're your enemy,
Yes,
is a serious problem in our society, even in politics.
big time.
Used to be when senators referred to each other as my esteemed colleague on the other side of the aisle, or my friend so and so on the other side of the aisle, there was truth in that. There was respect and there was friendship crossing the aisle. That has become much more attenuated and much less of that. And the phrases you hear now are much more almost as if they're enemies. And it's
Yes.
very hard to do business with your enemy.
Yeah, no, it is. I'm trying to think of the example I always like to use is Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. Bitter political enemies, but they understood each other and they were able to get
Hmm.
things done because they understood each other. And they had dinner frequently, had a beer frequently, if my memory serves me right from what I read.
Tip
I read a
O'Neill was
book.
a master of how to collaborate. Johnson, when he was in the Senate and Congress, he was as well. People forget that he was a true master of the houses.
Yeah, and I mean, what's really good there is they were able to. You can sit there and go, "Man, I disagree with your point to the core," but go, "Well, we can at least get this little sliver of it, apply that sliver of it." I had shared an episode recently, and it was in a group because I'm in all sorts of groups, and it was a group that was progressive, and the person goes, "There's too much compromise. We compromise too much." And I've seen it on both sides. This is just the most recent one. And if we compromise, everything's done. Like it has to be our way or no way. And I said, but that's literally the problem. He goes, no, we've compromised too much before. I'm like, no, no, we've got away from it, which is why we're at where we're at. And I use so many examples and I could not show this guy, no matter how hard I tried to see that, not that he was necessarily wrong, but to go, it's not as devious as you think it is.
Well, what you're saying, the truth that not only are a lot of people extreme these days, and by the way, the majority is still, overwhelming majority is still not extremist. The vast majority of Americans are centrist, whether to the left of center or to the right of center. But one of the things that has developed is a degree of certainty in one's positions, where more extreme believers cannot accept the notion of that they may be wrong or that another approach can work, which I think is a serious issue. When you approach everything that way, I'm definitely right, and there's no possibility of finding a solution that isn't exactly what I want, no matter what it is I'm thinking. It's a challenge.
No, I mean it is, and that's the and it's so hard to combat that because you could literally have the proof in the pudding. You could have, and if somebody's just in their core convinced of it, you're never going to convince them of anything else. I mean, I've
It's
just
very
learned
hard.
yeah, I've
It's
learned
very hard.
sometimes it's just better to go, hey, you're allowed to believe what you want to believe. Cool. We'll leave it at that. And just move because all you're doing is and I did that with this gentleman. And actually now, even though he disagrees with me, he's actually become an avid follower of my show and
Good.
comments on a lot of things. So, it was the fact that I was able to, and it's something that I've learned doing the show, right? Is, I'm not gonna lie, there's been times where I've been like gone back and forth with somebody online where I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, this is just, and then now I'm like, man, that gets me more angry than anything else in real life. And I'm like, I got to step
Yeah.
away and just remember that they get as worked up as I do, and half the time, I don't even think that they're trying to defend their position too much. And it gets in their way of
What
being
people
sane
do,
individuals.
which, by the way, makes our discussion that much easier because we're talking about a book of fiction rather than
Yes.
laying our hardline positions, political positions out there and debating them.
Yes. I mean, no, 1000%. And that's why like merging fact and fiction in a book is just it's refreshing these days. And people really need to check it out because we got to get a break from the chaos. We've got to, what did they always tell, like chase your dreams is what they used to say back in the day. And they don't say that to people anymore. At least I don't hear. If they do, I just don't hear it. I mean, and I think that that's part of it, right? And back in the day, fiction books, things of that nature, they really got you dreaming. How many devices have been invented? I watched a documentary or show, or whatever, on the History Channel once. There were so many inventions that came out of the original Star Trek where scientists had watched it and got inspired by it and then developed products that I don't know if it was the microwave or the cell phone. One of them was it was inspired by it.
Well, we haven't gotten yet to the teleportation device. That's the one I'm waiting for.
They actually
I want
have
to be
done it though.
beamed. I want to be beamed down successfully.
Yeah, if I remember right, Europe in the I think it's super collider or whatever they have.
Yeah, I've heard that there's a theoretical movement, but it's more theoretical than provable,
Yeah,
is my recollection of it.
yeah. I mean, the fact that they were even able to get that far was, it was great to see. If that makes any sense,
Yeah.
But Mark, again, I really appreciate you coming on. This was a powerful conversation.
Thanks, Joe. It
You
was
know,
real good, and I appreciate it
yeah.
very much.
Everybody, if you're on Rumble, follow us on there. Rumble, like I'll continue to say, is a lot more content friendly. Allows you to explore things, or YouTube, Spotify, Apple. Apple seems to be where we get a lot of our base from. Is America getting China right or way off? That's what we need to figure out. Definitely check out the book. It's so critical. Attacking the Dragon. The links are, like I said, in the comments / show notes. I'm Joe. This is Middle Ground Mike. Mark, I appreciate you coming on. No left, no right, forward. We'll see everybody next time.
Great.